My second hometown of Orvieto in central Italy is rich with works of art that still do their work in the places for which they were made. Several of these artworks will turn up as illustrations in my talk. Here's one. The most recently created work of art in the cathedral, or Duomo of Orvieto, are the bronze cast reliefs on the great central doors, commissioned to Emilio Greco in the 1960s following the Second Vatican Council. Complex, non-traditional, not immediately readable, these doors have grown on the Orvietani and me and look to have a long shelf life. They present the works of corporal mercy enumerated in Jesus' discourse on the end times in Matthew 25 as criteria by which God distinguishes the sheep from the goats, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, providing shelter for the homeless, caring for the sick, visiting those in prison, and added to those 6, burying the dead. I have been present at Mass when a beloved bishop of Orvieto would remark that the panels mark the great portal not so much as the entrance into the Duomo, but as our exit. To receive the body of Christ in the sacrament, he exhorted, should drive us out as the body of Christ sent into the world to do the work that he has given us to do, serving those in need. The bishop's reading of the doors, of course, captures the movement that this conference sets before us. The work of the people in worship and liturgy inside the church, Act 1, should shape our common life with one another, Act 2. And then Act 3, overflow out the doors into the various neighborhoods where the church also does its liturgy, its work of the people together. And for Bishop Scanavino, the artwork plays an intrinsic role in our work. In fact, I have heard several of my local Catholic friends testify that the doors soften their hearts and motivate them to care for the growing number of refugees, mainly from the northern half of Africa, that show up in Orvieto. My friend Alessandro says the doors re-inspire him in his ministry in the prison in Orvieto. To teach and remind and inspire us was, of course, their intention. In this hour together, I would like to explore the rippling outwards of the arts from their role in the liturgies of sacrament and worship to their role in building up the church community, to the missional service of the church beyond our own communities of faith. While sketching this arc of movement, I am charged to pay attention to the second act, how the arts can be put to work in shaping a common life in the life of the church, the phrase from the flyer, the program. I will be citing lots of examples, all taken from one period of time, roughly 1250 to 1550, and one place, Italy, partly because it has become home turf over the last 25 years, and therefore I can speak personally of my own bodily experience of these works of art over time. But also because during this period of Christendom, the visual arts were put to work in the life of Christian communities in more places and in more ways than many of us would imagine. I also think it's helpful to show how art worked in the fabric of a single society in order to help us to imagine such a coherent fabric in and for our own cultural time and place. So that makes it better than scattering around. It's good to see how it works together. I underline something. I am not presenting the Italian Renaissance as the model to emulate in style or medium or material, but rather as a rich body of exemplary material that might inspire us to put art to work similarly in our local place and time, just as it inspired the Cathedral Committee and Emilio Greco to make those doors. Who knows? Perhaps one of you or some of you will think about encouraging your church to commission an artwork dealing with the 7 works of mercy, installed in an appropriate place for your church. In fact, please consider my talk as a brainstorming session. It is the practical middle place between the rich theological foundations that Hans Boersma and Junius Johnson are providing us with. I've already referred to the capacity of the arts to teach or instruct, to remind or to prompt the memory, and to inspire or to arouse emotion. In fact, these three elements, engaging the intellect, the memory, and the affections, served as the oft-repeated defense of visual art in the Western Church for almost a millennium, beginning with Pope Gregory in 600 AD. The visual arts were understood to assist actions important in the life of the church, to enhance or transform the work, to use phrases of Nicholas Walderstorff and Ted Gioia regarding the work songs developed by prisoner work gangs in the South. As one of the inmates says, singing makes the work go so better. In fact, I'll say Walderstorff's chapter on work songs in his recent book, Art Rethought, The Social Practices of Art, is as applicable to the role of the arts in the work of the church as anything I've read. Isn't that interesting? So, anyway. Let me use the example, of the practice of preaching. I'm even giving you a little outline from time to time in case you're taking notes here. So, let me use the example of the practice of preaching, since I think we've got a few preachers in our midst, to give quick illustrations of 4 of the jobs that the visual arts could do. Okay? The body of the talk, I'll give you is really going through places, but right now I'm outlining the work that the arts were understood to do. So first, depicting models and inspiration heroes of the practice, which falls under remembering and inspiring by looking at those who have gone before us, who provide good models. Okay? As for preaching, the churches of the Mendicant orders I thought of, the Franciscans and Dominicans, in their monasteries always feature their great preachers. St. Francis, of course, and he's up there on the arch and there in the Assisi Basilica, of course, and the golden-tongued St. Anthony of Padua, preaching to the fishes, so another Franciscan, as well as being a fisher of men, and the gifted Franciscan San Bernardino of Siena. So I gave you 2 pictures of those. So here, heroes. Now, I'll ad-lib a bit. You see, St. Anthony, Francis preached to the birds. Well, Anthony preached to the fishes. And I give this because do you see the painting there? You can. It's really quite simple and primitive. It's not, in fact, I'm not even sure the artist is known. But it's not simplistic. Can you see a lovely picture of all the fish lined up in rows? And it's very attractive and it's very compelling for young people as well. So anyway, there you are. Okay, so in other words, depicting models for us. Second, the work of illustrating the practice of preaching. And of course, those 2, St. Anthony preaching and San Bernardino, those are also illustrating that practice. My example here of preaching, the cell fresco in Monastery San Marco, the Dominican monastery in Florence, of Jesus preaching to the disciples. Okay, there's an example. A bad example, that is an example of bad preaching, is found in the fresco of the preaching of the Antichrist in the San Brizio Chapel in the Orvieto Duomo, sowing confusion, as is reflected in the visual order of those listening. And if you have a chance to look at that, or if you come to Orvieto, you can see it's quite a body of people. They're confused. There he is on his pedestal. See the group of people around him? You know what? Do you see that? Look at the difference between the people all listening attentively and the fish. See there? And then look at that. So there you are. So we have it depicting models, illustrating the practice. And now thirdly, the role of the arts or the work of the arts in catechizing or in teaching us about the practice. Here for an example or 2, how to preach. The chapter house in the Dominican Order of Preachers in Santa Maria Novella in Florence depicts on one wall the educational curriculum for training preachers. On the opposite wall are the three great Dominican preachers at work as the Dominicanes. Dominicans, but in Italian that means the hounds of God, okay, the dogs of the Lord, shepherding the flock and warding off the heretics. And you'll see on the left, you see at the bottom of the three, that's St. Dominic himself, and then Peter, the martyred preacher, building up the flock, and then Thomas Aquinas on the right side there in the corner is preaching and refuting the heretics. So there's an example of catechizing. Okay, and then here, doing the practice. And I mean the arts engaged as a means of doing the practice. Just as Bishop Scanavino incorporated the Duomo doors into his sermon, we know it was common for the homilist on the first Sunday of Advent to refer to the frescoes in the San Brizio Chapel, which are themed to First Advent. In fact, the four manners of deception practiced by the Antichrist, namely false preaching, bribery, false miracles, and tortures. I just did a clockwise circle there in the scenes, correspond exactly to the sermon ideas for treating the Antichrist by the Dominican compiler of the Golden Legend. Got that? That's a real preaching manual right there. The immense fresco cycle of the life of the Virgin in the apse area behind the altar of the Orvieto Duomo provided sermon material for every one of the feast days associated with Mary. So was that clear? So the art is part of the practice of preaching and of doing many other things. Let me add a fifth job of the arts, one more timely than ever in what I call an age of slouching. And that is depicting the proper bodily comportment for the practice. That is, matching our body, our gestures, our posture to the significance of the occasion. Yes, the many depictions of great preachers preaching reveal their comportment. But here I want to widen the scope of my examples. Michael Baxendorf has shown how in a sermon on the Annunciation, a great 15th century Franciscan preacher, Fra Roberto, describes the stages of Mary's response to Gabriel. Her comportment was depicted in so many of the paintings of the Annunciation, each one of which show one of the stages of her response to Gabriel. Here is one, behold, be it unto me according to your word, the humility of the Virgin. Okay? So there's a beautiful painting. Here, a little treatise of St. Dominic's and his 9 modes of prayer, and that means postures for prayer, prompted a number of depictions in art of these postures, including those frescoed by Fra Angelico and his assistants on the walls of the novices' cells in the monastery. Okay? So there's one. In fact, this is one of the postures of prayer, and there are 9 of them. The Society, and look at this, the Society family were the sponsors of a private chapel. And then you see this, the patrons are painted in the fresco, but outside the adoration of the Magi. Do you see how that works? Well, those were the family, the husband and wife that commissioned and paid for it. It's their chapel. And look what happens, they imitate the shepherds. And do you see that Mrs. Sassetti's posture is exactly like Mary's? So they imitate the shepherds, and those present in the chapel can then imitate the pater and mater familias. So it ripples outside until the painting serves as the model for what we do, our proper comportment. Piero della Francesca's women in the Legend of the Holy Cross, who perhaps in a sequence enact the process of deep beholding a mystery. Now here again, I don't know if you can see well, but that's Empress Helena having discovered the true cross that when it was dug up. And do you see the three, she moved from left to right. Do you see that the woman, one of her waiting women, is like this, and then the second stage is like this, And then Helena goes like this. In fact, dare I say, if you're not, don't knock over your coffee cups, but do this. All of you, just go like this, and then like this, and then like that. And in fact, I'm convinced, well, you can think about this. When we behold some remarkable event, this is a miracle, the resurrecting of this dead fellow, because the true cross was passed over his body. At first, oh my goodness, whatever the gesture is of a kind of holy fear. Does that make sense? But then you want to see, and then you start leaning. Does that happen bodily? Okay, and then when you realize it's time to go like this, so that you can try that. Isn't that interesting? If this is a teaching of the proper comportment that is perfectly adequate to what is being beholden. So you can think about that. What I want to get across with this list is that for many centuries, the arts were understood as good at helping us do a wider set of actions than we have permitted them to do in the last couple of centuries. To be didactic, for example, to teach, has been a no-no during 2 centuries of art for art's sake, beneath the dignity of fine art that should be made and appreciated without instrumental purpose. Well, tell that to Pope Julius II when he hires Raphael and appoints his own humanist scholar librarian, Tommaso Inghirami, to work with Raphael to decorate Julius's library with highly sophisticated murals that teach us about the teachings of the various schools of philosophy in ancient Greece. So it was a teaching tool. Well, okay, that was a long preamble, and maybe I'll take a sip here. In the main portion of my talk, I set before us a dozen or so places, or settings, or occasions in which the arts once and for a long time were put to work in the life of the church. Artists were commissioned, gainfully employed. Imagine, I look at all of you artists, okay, to create not overly simplistic Sunday school art that doesn't keep on working, but thoughtful, skillful, sophisticated works of art adequate to the work of the people, that do their work over time, not to be taken in at one glance. As I go down my illustrated list, so this is important, ask yourself whether or not, why or why not, the arts are at work in each of these places in your church, or whether you even have such a place. And there may be good reasons for the not. Why not? You think about why there may be reasons for that absence. At the same time, begin a comparative mental inventory of the nameable places in your church and in other places where your church community gathers, noting whether they strike you as possible places or impossible or inappropriate places for installed artworks. In other words, respond individually to these lists, these examples I'll give you. Well, following this conference's 3-act drama, I begin in the sanctuary, the place that houses, as our brochure says, the central activity for the church of the church for all eternity, corporate worship. In fact, let me start with an unlikely place near the sanctuary that I bet few of us have thought about in terms of the arts of worship. Where do your clergy and the helpers in the liturgy put on their vestments if you worship in a church with vestments? But I get most of your churches, the clergy must gather, they don't just walk in off the parking lot, right? Well, where are they? If you or store the places where they prepare, or where they store the utensils involved in the liturgy of worship, chalice or altar cloth, candles, processional cross, and the like. Well, sacristies were often highly decorated in the period I am drawing from. The main wall in the sacristy in Santa Croce, the Franciscan church in Florence, draws together the events of Easter week, the way of the cross on the left, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. The sacristy in the Benedictine monastery of San Miniato, above Florence, looking down on it across the river, with its splendid life of Saint Benedict, painted by Spinello Aretino, not so much well known nowadays, not to mention the artistic marvels of the vestments, cloths, utensils stored and cared for in the sacristy. So that's the sacristy. What is suggested by the artistic attention to a sacristy? It's the clothing, closet in a certain way. So I'm asking you honestly, why do you think that so much attention was given to the decoration of such a room? Now, it's not that there's some standard answer, but my answer is to prepare for being deliverers of the sacraments, of the word preached, was no casual matter. And can you feel that the very place emphasizes the seriousness of what you folks are about to do? So straighten up, take it seriously. Okay. So that was one. Now here's my, excuse me. Yeah, in fact, maybe I have time. Can I read? This reminded me of a favorite poem of mine. In fact, my dissertation subject, George Herbert, It reminded me of his poem, Aaron. This poem, for me, illustrates or captures just what sacristies are to do. Holiness on the head, light and perfections on the breast, harmonious bells below, raising the dead to lead them unto life and rest. Thus are true errands dressed. Profaneness in my head, defects and darkness in my breast, a noise of passions ringing me for dead unto a place where is no rest. Poor priest, thus am I dressed. Only another head I have, another heart and breast, another music, making live, not dead, without whom I could have no rest. In him I am well dressed. That's a good poem. Can you imagine that as the prayer of the priest in the sacristy, being clothed in vestments that he or she knows I'm not worthy of? Well, there you go. I like that part of my talk. I was glad to have a chance to read that poem. Let's see where now. Okay, but now let's get down to business. Okay, these places. How about the place of celebrating the sacraments, certainly of Holy Communion and baptism? A sizable proportion of the artworks of the Renaissance are altarpieces, the paintings or sculpted reliefs on or above the altar as the background for the Eucharist. Every altarpiece foregrounds particular aspects of the sacramental action of receiving Christ. We must see these artworks not so much as added-on decoration, but as pieces of furniture intrinsic to the work done at the altar. Images of the Madonna and Child, for instance, her womb, the place of incarnation, of the real presence of Christ, of Holy Communion, serve as reminders that in receiving the body and blood of Christ, we ourselves, like Mary, are agreeing to become the tabernacles in which Christ is clothed in flesh for the life of the world. Think of John 6. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood dwells in me and I in them. So certain altarpieces make that real clear. In Botticelli's Virgin and the Child, which I have in the corner there, baby Jesus holds the grapes and wheat. Do you see that? A foreshadowing of his offering of the bread of life of his flesh, of the drink of eternal life in his blood. And then here's one that I wanted to pick. Fra Angelico's Annunciation with an expulsion from the Garden of Eden, okay, in the corner, the top left corner. So again, it's tiny, it's right up there. Can you see the top left corner? It's Adam and Eve being driven out of Eden. What in the world is that doing there? It'd be fun for you to think about that. I'll give one answer. And in fact, this is by no means unique. It happens several times in Annunciations. we apprehend the inverse parallelism of the two scenes. An angel expels our first parents from the garden through an arched gate into exile. That exile ends when another angel comes through another arched doorway to a new Eve, who by her yes to the Lord becomes the bearer of a new Adam. See how that, I'm sure of that. See how that works? Our undoing in the expulsion is itself undone by the Annunciation. How about baptismal fonts? Typically with scenes from the life of John the Baptist, always with the central episode of John's baptizing of Jesus. Often a featured artwork in art history books, but almost often plucked out of context for its innovative use of perspective in low bronze relief is Donatello's Feast of Herod. Okay, some of you will have seen that, maybe many of you. Well, that panel is one of 6 narrating the story of John the Baptist, made by 5 different artists in the baptistry of the Siena Cathedral. Okay, so I just wanted to remind you that that panel, so often depicted in art history books, that's where it is. It's one of a whole ensemble. Then, okay, the second thing, a place is in the corporate keeping of the church year. It was the occasion of tons of artworks. The liturgical calendar places us inside the annual rehearsal of the grand narrative of salvation history, the kairos time in which our chronos time receives its meaning and significance. So I was a couple of places in the church year. The first Sunday of Advent, in fact, as many of you know, if you follow the lectionary in your churches, focuses on Christ's second coming. Okay, he's coming back. You better get ready. The gospel readings alert us to the signs of the end times, as in the murals of the San Brizio Chapel. So I've already mentioned the entire chapel is full. It just is keyed to first Sunday of Advent. All those adorations of the shepherds, such as the altarpiece we looked at in the Sassetti Family Chapel in the Church of Santa Trinita in Florence, resonate richly during Christmastide, as do the dozens of the adorations of the Magi during Epiphany. The altarpiece, see if you can see that, the altarpiece in the private chapel of the Medici family in their palace in Florence feels empty. Now, you see, all you'll be able to see is just the altarpiece, but it's largely dark. Can you see what I'm talking about? 'Cause you know what? There's nobody there except Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus. Well, why? Okay, it feels empty because the 3 kings are making their journey around the walls of the chapel in Gozzoli's frescoes. Now, isn't that neat? So that here you are, as in worshiping there, imagine on Epiphany, and the Magi are encircling. You join the procession, and going up to receive communion at that altar is the place where you're turning. The whole chapel has that movement. I think that's pretty neat too. The artworks depicting Palm Sunday, the Last Supper, the Way of the Cross, the Resurrection are innumerable. Interestingly, look at this. In the fresco cycle of the scenes from the life of St. Peter in the private chapel of the family of Pietro Brancacci, the holidays in the church year featuring St. Peter based on non-canonical literature, namely the chairing of Peter and his martyrdom by upside-down crucifixion, are placed together on opposite sides of the lower layer of the frescoes that circle the chapter. They're separated from the scenes dealing with events recounted in Scripture. One scholar speaks of the festival mode in which paintings are precisely designed for the holy days on which they would come front and center. Okay? Now, again, I'm ad-libbing too much, but that's what I want us to think about. Have you thought seriously as a church community about artworks that are key to particular, doctrines, Holy Trinity, okay, or holidays in the church year? That doesn't mean they're irrelevant at other Sundays or times of the year, but they really start to sing on those days. I mean, they're powerful. It also always reminds us of the arc of the whole church year. Well, okay. And then I say that last example is that hence, as I've witnessed, on the church feast days pertaining to Mary, the fresco cycle surrounding the altar in the Orvieto Duomo is highlighted to the max in sermon, in everything about the service, okay? And then preaching, the place of preaching. Pulpits were given immense artistic attention. And I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures. Here's a few photos just of those carved by the father and son team of the Pisano family in several cities during the late 14th century. Okay, there's one. There's the one in the Siena Cathedral. But now look at this. You know, I'm emphasizing even in Catholic tradition, preaching mattered, you know. And here, of course, what does Paul say that we preach? We preach Christ crucified. In all of these pulpits, it's arranged so that the scene directly over which the preacher is preaching is the crucifixion. Do you see it there? There's the whole pulpit. You can see the lectern, and there's the crucifixion. This is the one in the baptistry of Pisa. Same thing. Beautiful pulpit, okay, carved. Now I'm starting to feel comfortable, and I want to ad-lib on everything. I think of my really wonderful but very preaching-oriented Calvinist background. My dad was a preacher. I mean, great. But all I had, there was nothing in the church. I just remember trying to make my lifesaver box that I got at Christmas last as long as possible. I would sit there doling out my lifesavers. That's my memory of getting through a sermon, okay? And I think if only I had had a pulpit like that to look at, I would have been mesmerized all the time. So that's what I think. And then finally, okay, music. Yes, here's an aspect of worship to which the image-suspicious Reformation contributed mightily with its solemnity and hymnody. Think as well of the enormous body of music written for the Mass and other services of the Church in Catholic tradition, but also in visual art. So I want to show you music as visually embodied. Witness the San Brizio Chapel in the Duomo of Orvieto again. I don't have a pointer here, but I'm looking at this. In the middle there, slightly to the left, the bottom left-hand corner is the crowning of the elect. And they're crowned and ushered into the heavenly kingdom by a band of angels. Do you see them with their lutes and guitars at the top? And then the groups of prophets and apostles on either side of Christ in majesty, which you can see there, along with the army of white-robed martyrs, are identified, and I mean the captions are written into the painting. You will almost be able to see it underneath the apostles there. Okay, so they're captioned. And in fact, they are identified by the exact phrases from the Te Deum. Okay, imagine, so you see there, Sanctus, 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 and then you look at the phrases in italics. Te, to you, the glorious chorus of the apostles, gloriosus apostolorum chorus. Te, prophetarum laudabilis numerus. Te, martyrum candidatus laudat exercitus. Do you see that? Those phrases are inscribed on the fresco of those groups. Can you imagine singing the Te Deum at Mass in this chapel on one of the great holy days of the church year, when the congregants on the floor sing in unison with the visible music of those already beholding the throne of God? So can you imagine that? So it's all of your sense. I mean, here you are singing and seeing singing. So I think that's neat too. Okay? Now look, and here too. Look at the cantoria, or the choir stalls, commissioned for the Duomo in Florence and sculpted during the 1440s by Donatello and Luca della Robbia. These are mind-boggling, and they are not made for the place in the museum of the cathedral where they are installed now. That's the photograph. They were placed above the doors to the sacristies in the Duomo on 2 of the 8 sides of the central space for the altar, one on the south side and the other on the north side. That's the one Donatello created, where little light reached them directly. So here goes. There they are, just in 2 photos. So that top one in this slide is the Donatello one, and then the bottom on Luca della Robbia's. Okay? And then you might be able to see along the bottom of that bottom photograph is Latin inscribed, and it is Psalm 150. Praise him with tambourine and dance. Praise him with strings and pipe. Inscribed in Latin across, okay? And there I give you, so it's inscribed, but there in order are the trumpets, the tubae, and then the psalterio, and the cithara, and then the timpano. So do you see perfect illustration of Psalm 150 and of the instruments that are referred to in that psalm? Illustrating one of the instruments named. Okay, now here, let's see, I think that's the best slide I have for you to look at. I will assume that there is no way financially, artistically, or architecturally for the churches represented in this room to undertake such a project. So I also realize I'm bowling you over with artworks that they were expensive. And that matters. But I'm also just making the point that they mattered. They were worth hiring the 2 fine sculptors to spend a year or so making these choir stalls. Okay? But plenty of our churches, okay, we may not be, but take a look at the classical sobriety of Luca della Robbia's, those panels, in contrast to the riotous abandonment of the singing kids in Donatello's stall. Can you see that? Della Robbia's is in these nice panels, and they are happily but soberly singing, all nicely contained. And in Donatello's here at the bottom, they're just running across the panel. And they are kids wild with abandon in that scene. You'll see it. Okay? So plenty of our churches, I wager, are dealing with what is often felt as the tension between the contemporary praise music played by the praise band and the old hymns in parts, or the hymnal, or the earlier traditions of music for the Mass, from antiphonic simplicity of music in monastic tradition to polyphonic complexity of Monteverdi and company. Here's a question for you. Might there be a way of visualizing either your commitment to one mode or your efforts to merge and integrate the two to help overcome an unwelcome dichotomy? Did that make sense? Do you see those two choir stalls? They in fact affirm and harmonize 2 of the issues of singing that we are still dealing with nowadays. If singing is important to your own church community's worship, have you thought carefully about the visuals that frame the music? The visibile cantare in the Latin. Okay? Actually, I'm in trouble, aren't I? Yeah, I know. I did. Well, that's okay. So I'm in trouble. Because now I'm in fact, I'm in big trouble. I've got to wrap this up here. Where I am is just at the heart of this, because I'm supposed to deal with the arts and the life of the church outside our worship. Okay? So, here you can get my list. How about dining together as a community? Do you have lunch after a service, potluck, services? Is it a service of outreach? Think of dining, how important it is for you. The Alpha program starts with a meal. Well, then dining. Look at all, there in the, wow, gee whiz, look at all these things. I'm giving you dining pictures, all right? Scriptural dinners are big in the Christian art of the past, okay? How about celebrating the significant life experiences of family and community? I have a picture. There's a birth tray, which was a traditional gift to a mother having given birth. Okay, and famous artists were commissioned to do these things. The bridal dowry chest. Those were major works of art, major pieces, illustrated. So I'm talking, just about the life there. Funerals. So you see all the things that I am not talking about. Then remembering the saintly heroes and heroines of the faith. There we are in the monasteries of the Benedictine monastery in southern Tuscany. And here, 3 miracles I wanted to go through of Benedict that refer to scriptural parallels. And then all about the and there's more, look at all those heroes of the faith under that. And then look there, okay? Okay. And then of meditative, and then later, meditative and contemplative reading of Scripture. Look at that. There's Mary and Martha reading and praying while the disciples are sleeping outside the house in Gethsemane. Okay. Then there's all the meditative reading in Monastery San Marco. Isn't that a beautiful picture? You should have that on the wall of your prayer and meditation. Okay. Or not that one. Do your own. And then other form. Then teaching and catechizing. I wanted to get to this, but in the ceiling above the baptistry in Siena, all the clauses of the Apostles' Creed, which are declared in baptism, are in the ceiling. Look at that, the whole thing, all of it. And then I love this. There's Benedict catechizing these peasant fellows from his cave up in the hills. He's got his hands out Presbyterian style. And then there's Francis catechizing the birds, and then I love that. That's our friend Simone using a cross in an exhibit of Russian icons to catechize the little kids, and look how enthralled they are, all right? Studying the great books. This is important. There's the School of Athens. The books are all labeled. That's not the School of Athens. That's the theology wall. The forefathers of the church had their books with titles printed, and there they are. Okay, then, in the San Brizio Chapel, the whole bottom layer are classical writers plus Dante with their books open. So the depiction of books was very big. Okay, and well, there we are. So and then, what I'm, so you see how I'm rushing through this third thing, okay? Then, of moving to the missional service of the church beyond our own communities of faith. I wanted that much of that work was done by the religious social clubs. That's the wrong word, but the confraternities, those who would take care of the orphans. And all the jobs that we consider of those 7 works of mercy largely were divvied up by established groups who were responsible for those. This is the gathering place for the guilds for their services in Florence. But this is the one I wanted to show you, and I am ending here, this is the hospital in Siena, directly across from the Duomo. And it is so richly decorated with the works of care and healing that go on in the hospital. And what about that? So I'm just, there, okay, but now I have to finish with this one sentence, okay? And that is, I want to be frank about how the Italian Renaissance does not give us many examples of a work of art of the sort that is more and more timely for us. How do we reach out winsomely, hospitably to those increasing numbers who have no truthful understanding of the good news of Christ, are suspicious of the dogmatic Christian types? Okay? And of course, in Christendom, which was, the assumed Christianity of Europe at the time, that was not needed. Do you see that? So here is where I'm really happy to say the Italian Renaissance does not give us much help. And now, look at that. There's our challenge. Can the arts play a role, perhaps an essential role, in the sort of reaching out to a narcissistic, self-absorbed, but desperately lonely culture? What about enriching the local civic life through the arts and music and theater and poetry? But anyway, you see where I'm off to? What are the ways in which we can put the arts to use in the neighborhoods and the places where we are called to go out and serve. There you are. I'll stop there. Thank you.